Most of the discourse about Stranglehold labels it as a Max Payne clone, or at the very least a game that is heavily inspired by Remedy's time-dilating, dive-rolling, depressing detective. And as someone who wasn't originally familiar with the work of John Woo, I assumed the exact same thing. But believe it or not, the genealogy is completely backwards, and Remedy didn't invent the style at all. They actually spent years writing a love letter to John Woo's 1992's cinematic masterpiece, Hard Boiled, which if you didn't know is actually Stranglehold's prequel. So Stranglehold isn't a clone, it's the official movie sequel. So Max Payne is literally inspired by the same source material that is supposedly a clone of Max Payne, which is obviously completely backwards and frankly a little bit funny, but not as funny as all of the people who think this is a quote from COD 4.
I like to keep this for close encounters.
But anyway, misquoting aside, reversing the timeline is only half the problem. The real irony of Stranglehold is that while the student captured the dark, tragic soul of Hong Kong noir perfectly, the master almost forgot it entirely, trading that tension for a cartoon of the genre where speedboats crash through living room doors and you run along the spine of a T-Rex. And it's less Hong Kong noir and more like some sort of breakfast time cartoon you'd watch before school while you ate your Cheerios. But all that aside, is Stranglehold worth playing today? And do you need to watch Hard Boiled to understand it? Well, let's find out, shall we? Now, it goes without saying that a lot of people describe Stranglehold as a Max Payne clone because of one major gameplay mechanic, and that is bullet time, or in this case, tequila time, like the drink. So the main character has swapped a pill habit for alcoholism, apparently, which is, I suppose, an improvement. Anyway, you can indeed slow down time, and it's a third-person shooter, just like Max Payne, but not really, for reasons we'll get into. So the game structure is entirely linear, and the whole thing will take you around 6 to 8 hours to finish, which is right about where you'd expect this sort of short, story-driven 7th-gen shooter to be. And for the most part, that description is actually quite apt for Stranglehold. It feels exactly like a game released on the 360, for better or worse. And it is worth noting that despite this being a literal movie sequel, Stranglehold is entirely self-contained, so you don't need to have watched a single frame of Hard Boiled for any of this to make sense. The game eases you into its universe by relying on a plot that's so simple and generic that it practically borders on a default template. And you'll have seen this 1,000 times before. Tequila is a renegade cop who gets results but plays by his own rules, and surprise, he's got a missing daughter who he needs to rescue from a rival triad syndicate while busting drug dealers along the way. It certainly won't light the world on fire, and the dialogue will probably cause your brain to slide into standby mode, or at the very worst make you cringe a bit, but as a narrative skeleton designed solely to transport you from one shootout to another, the story is fine. It's entirely harmless, predictable, and you don't need to have seen a single minute of the film to understand it, which honestly I think is the exact reason it's nothing like Max Payne. Hard Boiled actually is like Max Payne, at least tonally, and you'd naturally expect Stranglehold to match that pedigree, but all of that gritty noir weight is completely gone, and instead it's replaced with a flashy cartoon that treats its own license as a mere delivery mechanism for the gameplay. And look, that's totally fine, it is a video game after all, but it is a little bit odd to watch the original creator who made Hard Boiled return to this masterpiece and essentially strip away its soul in favor of this arcade spectacle, which is kind of like what Max Payne did, but not to the same degree that Stranglehold has. So it's nothing really like the film, apart from obviously the action set pieces. It's lost that sort of, I don't know, gritty bite, which Max Payne did obviously have. And speaking of that arcade spectacle, let's jump directly into the gameplay, which is the real meat on the bones for any game, cinematic or otherwise. And as you've probably noticed, this is a third-person shooter, but it completely rejects the waist-high cover shooter tropes which basically defined this generation. And instead, it's a chaotic, high-mobility movement shooter that weirdly reminds me of Sunset Overdrive. Now, I know that sounds like an odd comparison to draw on, but structurally, they are actually cut from the same cloth. Stranglehold is built entirely on this constant bouncing and vertical action, and you're always actively encouraged to run up handrails, swing on chandeliers, and slide across tables. just like Sunset Overdrive. The combat is balls to the wall and never really stops. And in fact, the original reveal trailer of Sunset Overdrive serves as a perfect description of Stranglehold. You know the one. It starts out like a parody of the gritty cover shooter before the colourful protagonist crashes in, bouncing off the walls and filling the room with flair. And that's exactly what Stranglehold is doing. So John Woo and Midway just got the idea long before Insomniac. And it just makes you wonder if their spidey senses were tingling at any point. So to call the gameplay fast-paced is a massive understatement, and right from the jump you're going to be thrown into these arenas where you'll be gunning down dozens and dozens of guys, all while sliding around like a lizard on ice without ever really having to pause to reload, which is exactly why it pains me to say that there's a fair bit to criticize. And I suppose we should start with the fundamentals, because you're actively encouraged to engage with your environment, but the actual execution of that is incredibly rigid. You interact with the map by pressing the left trigger, and whenever you approach an object, it will be highlighted in white, and it's shimmering in this sort of jump-on-me overlay, but the implementation is a little bit unpredictable and clunky. And at least in my experience, I was rarely interacting with the world in the way that I expected, and there was countless instances where I'd find myself awkwardly perched on the top of a wall and uncertain of where to go and completely unable to dive off, and it stripped away any sense of true control. And for a game that on paper takes away all of the guardrails and lets you run wild, it's remarkable how grounded and on rails this can actually feel, at least when these moments strike, and unfortunately they struck me quite often. While some of the game's levels handle it better than others, you do spend the majority of the game trapped in small, confined areas, and ironically, I did end up avoiding the stunts almost entirely just to maintain some baseline level of control. And again, in my experience, the pathing never really had this natural flow, and instead of feeling like a cinematic badass, I just found myself clumsily wandering around a table and trying to figure out which part of it I could get off and not being able to jump in the direction I wanted to, all while getting shot to pieces by 1,000 enemies. And I suppose what I'm saying is that the mechanical framework is fundamentally unintuitive, because it forces you to constantly micromanage where your feet are landing and where you're going to go to next, which is actually pretty difficult and a hard thing to do while you're simultaneously trying to aim, shoot, and not die. And admittedly, it's all probably to some degree down to player skill, and I don't claim to be a master on the sticks or anything, but I've played a lot of games, and I don't think Stranglehold is difficult. It just makes me feel like it's a little bit overwhelming and far too sloppy with how and what it throws at you when it comes to the traversal mechanics. So overall, while it's fun, it's fundamentally a flawed system, which brings me right back to my initial comparison, which was Sunset Overdrive. And I look to Insomniac's game as the gold standard when it comes to blending combat and traversal. And I think the difference with Sunset Overdrive is that it uses a subtle magnetism and momentum to reward you for keeping moving, and the environment is also open and a big playground. And Stranglehold, on the other hand, treats its levels like a series of rigid, automated train tracks which you need to click to interact with. And if you aren't lined up perfectly with the specific prop that the developer wants you to jump on, the illusion just shatters, leaving you in this stranded, static, and stuck phase, which is what I've been trying to describe. And to put the cherry on top, the game actually becomes a little bit easier if you just dispense with the traversal mechanics and just treat it like a standard third-person shooter, which sort of goes against the grain and the ethos of the game, because players are always going to choose the path of least resistance, and with Sunset Overdrive, you were definitely encouraged and also rewarded for keeping moving, and I don't think that's the case for Stranglehold. The whole style point thing just isn't enough of an incentive to keep moving. You just don't really care about those things, or at least I don't. One thing I will say, though, is that this rigid structure does actually reward repeat playthroughs, and I can easily imagine feeling entirely unstoppable if I'd fully memorized a level layout, optimized my route, and knew exactly which doorways the enemies were going to stream out of. And to some degree, I do actually enjoy the game a little bit more when I've gone back to it to replay a mission or two, but the fundamental sloppiness is still very much a permanent resident of the game's mechanics. So for a green playthrough through fresh eyes, the illusion falls mostly flat. And if a movement shooter requires you to have some sort of spreadsheet or map layout memorized just to feel fluid on your first run, I would argue that the baseline design is basically failing you, and it turns what should be an organic, reactory experience into a bit of a memory test, which is a bit of a shame, really. Now, bringing it back to those white shimmering interactions, that same logic applies to the environmental destruction too, which also brings me to another unsolicited comparison: Bulletstorm. The way Stranglehold pushes you to shoot the architecture rather than the enemies feels exactly like Epic's 2011 arcade shooter, Bulletstorm. You're actively rewarded with style points for getting creative, so a basic headshot is boring, and dropping a massive air conditioning unit onto a group of unsuspecting triads or collapsing a concrete pillar is just more fun, and it actually racks up more score, just like it does in Bulletstorm. And this gameplay loop is actually pretty fun, although it did take me a bit of getting used to, because naturally in most games you shoot at the people and not what's around them. But one thing it does actually showcase is how impressive the destruction actually is. Almost everything is destructible to at least some degree, and you can shoot holes in walls, break windows, and destroy environments until your heart's content. And I'd say that this was a nice change of pace from my issues with the movement mechanics, because where that felt oddly restrictive, the destruction feels genuinely liberating, because you're able to just blast your way through practically everything, and generally you have just no regard for public damage, which is actually something you get scored on, so the more damage, the better. And again, it feels like Bulletstorm, because after each mission, your performance is graded and you're constantly earning these style points for doing things differently, so you're definitely better off looking for new ways to dispatch all the enemies, which there's a lot of, so plenty to go at. But obscure shooters aside, while all of this environmental interaction is conceptually very cool and genuinely fun, it is also let down a little bit by a couple of things, one of which is sort of connected to my gripes with the traversal mechanics, and that is the camera. I already mentioned how each mission is set in some pretty small arenas, and what that often means where the camera is concerned is not being able to see properly. And there's numerous times in my playthrough where I'd be struggling to see shit because it's around a weird corner, or maybe the camera is just inside a wall or something, and it's just all a little bit clunky and could have done with being that bit further back, just so you could see a bit more. Because peripheral vision is actually really important in a game like Stranglehold, and you're often surrounded and need to move around in a full 360-degree motion, so having that camera punched in so tight actually ended up being a little bit of a liability and was liable to get stuck and just felt a little bit annoying. But it's something that I would say didn't ruin the game. It's just something to keep in mind if you intend to play it, and probably something you could fix on PC, but I played on Xbox, so I suppose it's just one of those things, really. And one other thing I will say about the camera, which is similar to the traversal also, is that some of the missions were definitely worse than others, and specifically the missions where you have to go inside the houses or destroy the boats. They were some of the worst missions when it came to the camera, so I would say that it's a little bit hit and miss, but definitely not something that's going to completely destroy a playthrough by any means. And actually, speaking of platforms, I don't think it's too dramatic to say that Stranglehold runs pretty poorly, and probably about as bad as it gets when it comes to 360 games, at least in my experience. When some of the big action set pieces really get going, the FPS really starts to tank, and some of the missions in particular were really quite bad, like this one with all of the god-awful rain on the screen, which was not only making it lag, but also made it so you couldn't really see anything, which was really bad, and these visuals are some of the worst parts of the game, in my opinion. But I would definitely say that it's worth checking it out on PC if performance is a concern, and I'm not going to dwell on it for too long because, well, it is what it is, but yeah, those rain physics, man, they're pretty terrible. Anyway, I've managed to make it this far, and I've not really talked about some of the mechanics which actually make Stranglehold, and that is, of course, the superpowers, if that's what you want to call them. It's what I'm calling them. And as mentioned earlier, you've got something called Tequila time, yes, like the drink, which lets you slow down time. But on top of that, you also have something called Tequila bombs, or what I've described as superpowers, and these are special abilities tied to the directional pad that you can charge up by ranking up with style points or collecting these glowing origami paper cranes that are randomly scattered throughout the environments. And the first ability you unlock is essentially a portable medkit, so when your health bar is looking a bit tragic, you can give yourself a quick patch-up. And it doesn't actually heal you all the way like the actual full medkits do, which are those things that you can see littered around the levels, but it will get you out of the red and out of a pinch if you need to use it. Next up is a precision aim ability where the camera punches in for a cinematic single-shot sniper bullet which lets you target an enemy specifically, and honestly, I didn't really find this all that useful, and stopping everything to carefully delete one guy just feels a little bit pointless when the game is routinely flooding the room with like 20 guys at a time, so I suppose it's fine to take out the occasional annoying sniper across the map, but even then, I rarely touched it, and I don't think this ability is really all that useful. The final two abilities, however, are where things get really quite ridiculous. The first of which is Barrage, which grants you a temporary invulnerability, boosts your damage output, and gives you infinite ammo without needing to reload. So it's basically like quad damage, I suppose, from Doom. And it's fantastic for shredding through heavy targets and tearing through an entire room if you've got caught in a bit of a jam, shall we say. So it's one of the more useful powers, really. And then finally, what you have is my favorite, the crowd-clearing masterpiece, the Barrage Spin. And essentially, this causes the Inspector Tequila to spin in a 360-degree circle while a flock of doves mysteriously materialize around him for some reason. I don't know why. But you spin around and you kill everything in the room, which is pretty much a click this button to kill everything type thing. And it's just a really cool power and something that I used all of the time. And it's pretty much like a get-out-of-jail-free card, if you want to call it that. But it's entirely unrealistic, just like the rest of the game is. So that's probably why it's my favorite power, but I think the doves make it a bit, ridiculous too. And ridiculous is actually more or less how I'd describe Stranglehold as a whole. It's not at all what I expected as a sequel to Hard Boiled, and like I said near the start, it's more so got that morning time cartoon energy than it does any sort of noir, gritty setting or anything that approaches Max Payne, which makes me really question why people think it's a clone, because other than some of its simple bullet time mechanics, I really don't think it's anything like even Hard Boiled or Max Payne, even though those two things are more like each other than Stranglehold is like Hard Boiled, if that makes sense. So how do we sum up the game Stranglehold? I think it's a fascinating but also deeply compromised contradiction of a game. On one hand, it's a liberating, balls-to-the-wall action arcade spectacle that treats physics like a suggestion and collateral damage as its high score. And when you actually nail its clunky mechanics, it can feel deeply rewarding and, in basic terms, quite fun. But on the other hand, it's held back by the cold, hard reality of its era. The traversal framework is rigid and sloppy and doesn't really serve the fluid momentum that the game desperately craves. And that ultimately means that a lot of the game, you play it more like a traditional shooter, which absolutely isn't what Stranglehold is or could be. And combine that with a claustrophobic camera and what I think is a pretty weak story, it can be hard to find a silver lining, but ultimately, Stranglehold isn't a bad game, and it certainly isn't just a lazy Max Payne clone. I think it's a proto-movement shooter born a generation too early. It's a brilliant, chaotic concept trapped inside a clunky and unpolished scaffolding, which was pretty much characteristic of 2007, but it's still definitely worth a go.